Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Scott Kleppe, here on the line with Dr. Jaime Fergie from Driscoll Children's, and I'm the sports medicine physician here at Driscoll Children's. I know there's a lot of questions out there right now about how to return children to school, but also how do we return to sport? And we wanted to discuss some things in light of how to return to activity with the current pandemic and give you some ideas, concepts, guidelines that we can focus on and hopefully answer some of your questions. So I'll start by reading off some of the questions that we've had submitted to us, starting with, many children have spent a lot of time indoors the last few months. What is a safe way for them to return to exercise and sports after so much inactivity? I think it's a great question. Whether we're in a pandemic or we're simply returning to sports after a long summer break, the answer is gradually. If you don't return to sports gradually, then you are going to injure yourself, especially if you haven't been doing anything for an extended period of time. We got shut down with quarantine and gyms were closed and things of that nature. And so a lot of people weren't doing much. And now I've been seeing a lot of injuries from people who have tried to go out and overdo themselves after a period of inactivity. So you want to also, we'll address some of this a little later as well, but speaking of not being active and going to activity, we also need to consider the climate, especially here in Corpus Christi, Texas, where it is hot. It's not good to go from a cool indoor setting to the outdoor where it's humid, hot. You have to gradually do that as well. Start from doing something that doesn't require a lot of heavy equipment and gradually work your way up to your full speed activity. But you need to make sure that you get acclimatized before you start doing things from being cool inside to being in that hot, humid environment we have here. This next question is going to involve some questions we have about COVID-19. It says, what general COVID-19 precautions can be taken when children are exercising or playing? And I'll mention what I've heard and listened to from the sports world. A lot of the same concepts apply to what we've been telling everyone to do out in the community. The social distancing, 6 feet apart, wearing a mask when you can, trying to avoid close contact encounters, not sharing equipment, not sharing water bottles. Everyone has their own flavor of how to return to sports, but a lot of the concepts that we're implementing right now are being implemented in the sports world as well. So the basic things still apply in terms of the social distancing, mask wearing, things of that nature. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Fergie if he has any other insights in regards to that.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Kleppe, and I completely agree with what you said. Clearly, the message we have been giving to people in general very much apply to going back to sports. And I think I want the community to realize that there are several risk categories on this. There are activities that are going to be extremely low risk, like going out by yourself running from the COVID point of view. And that risk is going to increase as you go into team-based practice, for example, or a little bit more when you go into competition or full competition in the same geographical area, so that the more contact person to person, of course, the higher the risk you are. The more you share equipment, as you mentioned, the higher the risk. So I think those concepts are valid in sports, in the community. The same as to remind people that the hand sanitation is important. It's always been important. It's more important now. Just use soap and water 20 seconds if you can, because sometimes it's not available. Be sure you have your alcohol-based hand sanitizer and use it frequently. Now, the use of mask, great. If the sports allow you to wear the mask, if it is something that you can use safely, do it. That is going to protect the other people, and it's going to protect you too a little bit. So all of those things are important. People high risk, players who are high risk because they have diabetes, they have heart disease, they have other issues. Well, perhaps those we need to speak individually, and I would advise you to talk to your doctor in detail, because then you are a little bit, it's more concerning for you. But in general, children who are healthy, are going to tolerate, even if they get sick, are going to tolerate it very well.
Wonderful. And that actually leads us into our next question about should face masks be used for exercise or sports? And I agree with Dr. Fergie. You want to wear a face mask when you can. Even things like being in the dugout, being on the bench, team chats, arriving to your sporting event, departing from your sporting event. Anytime you can't socially distance those 6 feet, the more you can wear a mask, the better. And like Dr. Fergie said, it is going to vary based on what you're doing. Swimmers might not be able, you can't wear a mask in that environment, but in some other sports, it's a little bit more conducive to wear that protection.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So next question, how soon after having COVID-19 should someone go back to exercising or sports? A lot of what we've been seeing lately, everything's changing. We're learning, we're all in this together, learning new things each day. And I will tell you that if you have been diagnosed with COVID-19, you should see your physician before returning to sport, especially, like Dr. Fergie said, if you're somebody who's been hospitalized or had severe symptoms, and especially if you're having ongoing symptoms like chest pain with activity. Although rare, we have been hearing in the sports community, and just like we've seen some of these college divisions not participating this year because of some heart issues from a cardiopulmonary standpoint, a heart and lung standpoint, we are seeing some infection to the heart muscle itself that can be causing a problem after you've had a COVID-19 infection. And so if you're having those symptoms, if you're having chest pain, shortness of breath that wasn't there prior to having the infection, you absolutely should see your physician before continuing on with that physical activity. The other thing I was going to mention too, you ask about safety to return after a COVID-19 infection. The other thing we're seeing a lot in the sports world is the mental health aspect and going to see your doctor because a lot of athletes are having depression from not being able to do what they want to do. Those numbers are increasing. And so getting in touch with your doctor is a good home base for you to discuss either your return to sport or talk about your mental status and also maybe even catch up on some vaccinations that you may not have received over the last few months due to being locked down or not being able to see your physician. What do you think, Dr. Fergie?
Well, yeah, Dr. Kleppe, I do agree completely with you. And I would say that, a majority of the children we're diagnosing with COVID-19 is what I call incidental diagnosis. People who come in with a broken bone or are having surgery or they're scheduled for a procedure. We routinely test and we find out you also have COVID-19, but have absolutely no symptoms. So I think that's a different category. If you never had any symptoms, then I'd see no concern that point of view. You just need to be isolated for at least 10 days after you are tested. But the people I think you and I are more concerned with are those who have been sick with this, who have been, having a fevers and muscle pain and aches and the chills and the fatigue. And we have seen some children who have persistent fatigue for a while. Those are the ones that we need to be careful. They need to be seeing their doctors. But the great majority of the children that have been tested at our institution actually are either asymptomatic or minimal symptoms. So those are probably, not a big problem for them to go back.
Wonderful. Thank you. One of our next questions is general exercise sports question. What are the best things to drink or eat? Should kids eat before exercise or sports or wait until after? And I think you absolutely need to make sure you fuel your body. A small snack before working out is great. You obviously don't want to have a giant meal before working out, but there's 3 macronutrients that our body runs on: protein, fats, and carbohydrates. And depending on how much activity you're doing, carbohydrates are the energy source that our body uses for kind of that short-term, intense exercise. If you're talking about more long-term or prolonged low-intensity exercise, fats are a great source. So you want to find a nutritional snack that incorporates some carbohydrates, some healthy fats, and some protein. Although protein is kind of a minor source of fuel during exercise, it's also good to help keep you feeling full and at the top of your abilities. So carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are what you want to focus on. And I do think that, yes, you should eat before exercise to avoid drops in sugars and things like that. It's the healthy thing to do. Make sure your body is running at its optimal capacity. The next question we got are, what are precautions to take in South Texas heat? That's a great question. It's hot down here. And like I mentioned earlier, you have to let your body become acclimatized to the environment. You can't go from being inside for the last several months to going out and practicing football in pads in this humid environment. You have to work your way up to that. If not, you're going to get dehydrated. You need to make sure that you drink fluids. One rule of thumb is that we tend to recommend for every pound of weight lost during exercise, you should be consuming 2 to 3 cups of fluid. Water is generally a good choice for the short term. Practices an hour or so, water is great. If you're doing things longer than an hour, sometimes we recommend adding a electrolyte containing fluid to your choices, and something like a Pedialyte, something of that nature. And you have to remember too that hydration occurs before, during, and after exercise. You need to make sure you're drinking beforehand, make sure you're drinking during, and also making sure that you're drinking afterwards. So that's what I would say about about the South Texas heat and how to stay hydrated. The next question we got is, how important is stretching? Very important is the answer. We generally recommend doing a dynamic stretch prior to exercise and then a more static stretch following exercise. If you don't stretch, those muscles don't have a good opportunity to warm up and kind of stretch to their capacity. And if you start going from muscles that haven't been stretched to your full speed capacity of exercise, you're going to end up injuring yourself because the muscles weren't ready for that. So doing things like windmills and other static stretches are beneficial to start out with. And then once you're done, doing some more static stretching has been shown to be beneficial. And it does prevent injuries. The next question we got, I'll let Dr. Fergie chime back in here. Can COVID-19 be spread by sweat? Can it be spread by sharing the same drink? And I'll say that I haven't seen anything that says that it's transmitted by sweat. It's respiratory droplets from what I hear, but that doesn't mean that respiratory droplets can't be on sweaty sports pads and things of that nature. So I would say from my answer that sharing water bottles, sharing equipment, we want to avoid that as much as possible. But I want to hear what Dr. Fergie has to say.
Yeah, again, I do agree with you. I think the sharing anything in which there's been the potential for saliva contamination is not a good idea, because that's exactly the way this virus is transmitted. So that is certainly clear cut. Don't do it. Sweat is not an issue that we know of at all in terms of transmission. Of course, it can be contaminated like any other surface. The body can be contaminated with the droplet, but the sweat itself is not where the virus is. So I think that, common sense precautions, thing that we should have done anyhow before COVID-19, like not sharing drinks between players. Well, we should, we have even a better reason to do it right now.
Next question we have is, should there be a time limit on how long kids exercise or play sports at one time? I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about getting yourself gradually back into activity. You certainly should not go from being on the couch all day watching television to going and trying and running several miles. You should certainly gradually work your way up to more intense activity and activities of longer duration. So I'll say that. And then one other thing I wanted to add, because I did have kind of a thought myself, and from what we've been hearing in the sports community from Dr. Fergie's standpoint, is the actual time where we see the incidence of risk of transmission of COVID being more about sports transportation than some of the activities themselves. In the sporting world, there's been a lot of talk about these sports teams that travel together as being a time where the risk of transmission is maybe at a higher risk. I know there was a study done in Germany looking at how much time soccer players actually spent in close contact with each other during the game, and it was somewhere on the order of minutes. I think it was maybe 8 minutes. And then those teams got in their respective buses and returned home. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, okay, 8 minutes of contact during the sport versus the transportation to get to and from the sport. So I do think that we need to be conscientious of that when it comes to having sporting events. It's not just the sports themselves, but the time period surrounding those sports and what we're doing in terms of being in the locker room, being in the transportation vehicles, things like that. So I kind of wanted to bring that up and see what Dr. Fergie had to say about that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to take precaution. That's a good place to wear your mask and social distance as much as you can. And also, there's a good point for me to remind people, say, in this sports event, these activities, let's limit the amount of people who go there and the spectators who go there. If I'm just distance these people, because we don't really need a lot of people. The main way of transmission of the COVID-19 that we have realized and everybody knows now is really from the adult to the child, more than the child to child, child to adult. So I think I would focus on the parents, on the attendees, on the staff, on the trainers, on the coaches. They are the ones who really have to take precautions between themselves and their students. And they are the ones who should be telling people the guidelines, what they need to follow, reminding them of all the things that we have talked about today to keep their players safe. I couldn't agree anymore with Dr. Kleppe of the need for the children to go back to sport, the same as the need of the children to go back to school. But it has to be done safely and in a smart way. And I think that it's important within the school, within the activities, the sport, and also whatever we do in the community is going to facilitate going back to the sports and going back to schools.
Wonderful. Okay, well, that wraps up the questions that we have. I want to say thank you for submitting your questions, and please keep them coming. Here at Driscoll, we want to continue. Things are changing, and we know that. We know there's a lot of questions out there, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but we do the best we can to keep up with what's being done around the nation in terms of getting children back to school, back to sports, back to life. And so thank you again, and we would love to hear your questions and hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you very much also from my side here.